Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. Cursed Shadows of Despair. Scray story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Unveiling. The road wound through the dense forest, the tall pines casting long shadows in the fading light. Emma tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. She'd left the bustling city behind, seeking solace in the small, remote town of Ravenswood, known for its dark history and eerie legends. The town's ominous reputation didn't deter her. Rather, it drew her in. After the loss of her husband, she needed a fresh start, away from the memories that haunted her every waking moment. Ravenswood's main street was quaint, lined with old brick buildings and a handful of shops that seemed untouched by time. Emma's new home, a Victorian-style house, stood at the edge of town, its once grand facade now weathered and overgrown with ivy. She parked her car and took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. This was it, her new beginning. As she stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaked under her weight, echoing through the empty rooms. She wandered through the house, taking in the high ceilings and intricate woodwork. Despite its neglected state, the house had a certain charm, a lingering sense of history that intrigued her. Emma climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the musty smell of old wood and dust growing stronger with each step. She pushed open the heavy door, revealing a cluttered space filled with forgotten relics. Among the piles of old furniture and boxes, something caught her eye: an old, dusty diary, bound in cracked leather. She opened the diary, its pages yellowed and brittle, revealing handwritten entries detailing strange occurrences in the house. The entries spoke of shadowy figures, whispers in the night, and an ancient curse that plagued the land. Emma's heart raced as she read on, the words pulling her deeper into the mystery. The sound of footsteps on the stairs startled her. She turned to see Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, standing in the doorway. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to pierce through the dim light. "Found something interesting, I see," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice a gravelly whisper. "That diary belonged to the previous owner. Poor soul couldn't handle the disturbances." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Disturbances? Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "This town has a dark past, dear. Best be careful." Later that evening, as Emma unpacked her belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air seemed to grow colder. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the unease lingered. She decided to visit the local historian, Jacob, the next day. Maybe he could shed some light on the diary and the town's history. As night fell, Emma lay in bed, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. Somewhere in the darkness, she could almost hear the faint whispers of the past, beckoning her to uncover the secrets that Ravenswood so desperately tried to keep hidden. Chapter 2. The Curse's Origins. Emma awoke to a gray, misty morning, the remnants of uneasy dreams clinging to her like cobwebs. The air in the house felt colder than usual, an unsettling chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She dressed quickly, eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere behind, and made her way to the town's library. The Ravenswood Library, a grand old building with ivy-covered walls, stood as a testament to the town's storied past. Inside, the scent of aged paper and polished wood filled the air. Emma felt a strange comfort in the quiet, scholarly environment. She spotted Jacob, the local historian, sitting at a large oak table, surrounded by stacks of books and yellowed documents. "Morning, Emma," Jacob greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You mentioned finding something interesting? Emma placed the diary on the table, its cracked leather cover seeming even more fragile in the soft light. I found this in my attic. It mentions strange occurrences and a curse. I was hoping you could help me understand. Jacob's expression grew serious as he carefully opened the diary, flipping through the brittle pages. This is fascinating. There are references to a witch trial from the late 1600s. Ravenswood was one of the many towns swept up in the hysteria of that era. They spent hours poring over records, piecing together the fragmented history. According to the documents, a woman named Eliza Blackwood had been accused of witchcraft and subsequently executed. Her death marked the beginning of a series of inexplicable events, crop failures, mysterious illnesses, and disappearances. Townsfolk had come to believe that Eliza had cursed the land with her dying breath. As they worked, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the library seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the unease lingered. Jacob pulled out a map of the town from the 1700s, tracing a finger over the faded lines. Eliza's cabin was located in the woods, not far from your house. The diary suggests that the curse is tied to that site. Emma's skepticism wavered as she recalled the strange sensations in her home, the cold spots, the whispers at night. Do you really think a curse could be real? Jacob leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. History is full of mysteries. Whether it's a curse or not, something has left its mark on this town. It's worth investigating further. That night, as Emma returned home, the sense of foreboding intensified. Her dreams were plagued with visions of Eliza Blackwood, her face twisted in agony and rage. She awoke in a cold sweat, the room feeling unnaturally frigid. Emma struggled to reconcile her rational mind with the growing list of eerie experiences. The diary's words echoed in her thoughts, mingling with Mrs. Thompson's warnings and Jacob's cautious curiosity. She knew she had to dig deeper, to uncover the truth about Ravenswood and the curse that seemed to tighten its grip on her with each passing day. As she lay in bed, the silence was broken by a faint whisper, so soft she could barely make it out. Emma's heart pounded as she strained to listen, the voice seeming to call her name, beckoning her into the shadows. Chapter 3: Rising Shadows. Emma's heart raced as the whispering voices faded into the early morning light. Determined not to let fear consume her, she got up and dressed quickly, her thoughts fixed on the diary and the curse. The events of the past few days had left her shaken, but also resolute. She needed to uncover the truth. The day passed in a blur of research and restless energy. By evening, Emma felt the weight of the house pressing down on her once again. She wandered through the rooms, the shadows growing long and dark. The old house seemed to come alive at night, the creaks and groans of the settling wood echoing ominously. As she prepared for bed, a sudden chill swept through the room. Emma turned, her breath catching as she saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. She blinked, and it was gone, but the fear lingered. She hurried to her window, looking out into the dark, dense woods that bordered her property. The trees swayed eerily in the wind, casting strange shapes on the ground. Determined to understand what was happening, Emma called Jacob the next morning. They decided to explore the woods near her house, hoping to find Eliza Blackwood's cabin and any clues it might hold. As they trudged through the underbrush, Emma felt a growing bond with Jacob. His calm demeanor and shared curiosity provided a much-needed anchor in the storm of uncertainty. The woods were dense and silent, their stillness unsettling. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, half buried under years of fallen leaves and ivy. Inside, they found remnants of old artifacts, rusted tools, broken pottery, and strange symbols carved into the wooden beams. That night, back at her house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she moved through the dimly lit hallway, a cold draft brushed past her, and she heard a faint, disembodied voice whispering her name. Objects began to move on their own. A book slid off the shelf. A chair scraped across the floor. She was no longer just an observer. The curse was now actively reaching out to her. The next day, Emma decided to search her house more thoroughly. In the basement, she discovered a hidden door behind a stack of old crates. Her heart pounded as she pried it open, revealing a small, secret room. The walls were covered in symbols similar to those in the cabin, and in the center of the room stood an altar adorned with ancient artifacts. Emma knew she was closer to understanding the curse. She and Jacob spent hours deciphering the symbols, piecing together the history and purpose of the altar. Mrs. Thompson's warnings echoed in Emma's mind, and she began to trust the elderly woman's cryptic advice more and more. As the supernatural occurrences escalated, Emma and Jacob grew closer, united by their shared mission. The shadows that haunted her house seemed to strengthen their resolve rather than weaken it. Emma was determined to uncover the truth behind the curse and find a way to break its hold on Ravenswood, no matter what it took. Chapter 4: Descent into Darkness. The next morning, Emma and Jacob made their way to the local cemetery, the air heavy with anticipation and dread. The cemetery was old, the tombstones worn and cracked, names barely legible under layers of moss and lichen. As they walked among the graves, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching them from the shadows. "We're looking for the graves of those involved in Eliza Blackwood's trial," Jacob said, scanning the faded inscriptions. After some searching, they found a cluster of graves marked with the same year, 1692, the year of the witch trials. The names matched those mentioned in the diary. Emma knelt beside one of the graves, her fingers tracing the name carved into the stone. These people, they were part of it. They accused her, condemned her. Jacob nodded, his expression grim, and they paid the price. The curse wasn't just on Eliza, it was on everyone who played a role in her death. The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, pressing in on them. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she stood, her eyes drifting toward the edge of the cemetery where the forest loomed. "We need to go back to the cabin." The walk through the woods was tense, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. When they reached the abandoned cabin, Emma felt a surge of unease. The air inside was cold, and the symbols carved into the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. They found more artifacts, charms, bones, and a weathered journal that appeared to be Eliza's. As they read her final, desperate entries, Emma's vision blurred and she stumbled back, feeling a searing pain across her arm. She looked down to see scratches forming, as if an invisible hand was clawing at her skin. "Emma!" Jacob rushed to her side, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." They fled the cabin, the shadows chasing them, whispering in a language Emma couldn't understand. By the time they reached her house, she was trembling. The shadows had become more aggressive and the hallucinations more vivid. That night, Emma's dreams were a tangled web of nightmares. She saw Eliza's face, twisted in pain and anger, and felt the weight of the curse bearing down on her. When she awoke, she found herself standing in the secret room in the basement, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. Her mental state began to deteriorate as the days passed. She questioned her sanity, doubting her own memories and experiences. The shadows whispered her darkest fears, taunting her with visions of her husband's death and her own perceived failures. She felt isolated, her grip on reality slipping as she confronted her personal demons. Jacob remained a steadfast ally, but even his presence couldn't quell the growing terror. Emma knew she was descending into darkness, the curse tightening its hold on her mind and soul. She had to find a way to break free, but the path was becoming increasingly unclear, shrouded in the shadows that now dominated her life. Chapter 5: The Heart of Fear. Emma's days blurred into a haze of dread and exhaustion. The shadows grew bolder, their whispers louder and more insistent. It was during one of these bleak days that Jacob called, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think I found something," he said. "Meet me at the Historical Society." Emma arrived to find Jacob surrounded by ancient texts and dusty scrolls. He held up a fragile piece of parchment, its edges frayed and brittle. "This is a ritual," he explained, his eyes alight with discovery. "It's old, but it might be our answer. It involves confronting the source of the shadows, Eliza's spirit, and breaking the curse directly." Emma felt a spark of hope amid her fear. "What do we need?" Jacob's expression turned grave. "It requires a civic place, the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. And there's something else, a personal item of Eliza's, something that holds her essence." "It's dangerous, Emma. The ritual could provoke the shadows even more." Determined to end the nightmare, Emma agreed. That evening, as she prepared for the ritual, Mrs. Thompson appeared at her door, her face pale and drawn. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was low and urgent. "You need to know the truth before you proceed." Emma felt a surge of anger. "What truth?" Mrs. Thompson sighed, her shoulders sagging. "My family. We were the ones who accused Eliza. We believed she cursed us as she died, but we never admitted our guilt. The curse binds us too." Emma recoiled in shock. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. "I was afraid of the truth and of the curse. But you need to know the ritual is perilous. Eliza's spirit is vengeful. She'll fight you." Emma's resolve hardened. "I have to try. I can't live like this. None of us can." Night fell as Emma and Jacob made their way to the abandoned church, its decaying facade looming like a specter in the moonlight. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the pews broken and scattered. They set up the ritual circle in the center of the nave, placing Eliza's journal, the personal item they had chosen, on the altar. As they began the incantations, the shadows gathered, swirling around them with increasing fury. The temperature plummeted, and Emma felt a piercing cold seep into her bones. She glanced at Jacob, whose face was set with grim determination. The shadows congealed into a dark, roiling mass. From its depths, a figure emerged, Eliza Blackwood, her eyes burning with rage and sorrow. Emma felt a surge of terror, but forced herself to stand her ground. "Eliza!" Emma shouted over the howling wind. "We know the truth. We're here to end this. We want to set you free." Eliza's form flickered, her expression shifting from anger to something almost like relief. The shadows intensified, lashing out at Emma and Jacob, but they held firm, continuing the ritual. The church seemed to shake, the very air vibrating with dark energy. In a final, desperate effort, Emma chanted the last words of the ritual. The shadows screamed and writhed, and then, with a blinding flash of light, they were gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Jacob knelt beside her, his face a mix of exhaustion and triumph. They had done it. The curse was lifted. But as Emma looked around the ruined church, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more to uncover, more to understand about the dark history of Ravenswood. And she would face it all, whatever it took, with Jacob and Mrs. Thompson by her side. Chapter 6: Confrontation. Emma and Jacob's victory in the abandoned church felt hollow. The sense of triumph was quickly overshadowed by the realization that the true battle lay ahead. The final confrontation would take place in the heart of the forest, where the curse had been born. The moon hung low in the sky as they trudged through the dense woods, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Mrs. Thompson had insisted on joining them, her frail form wrapped in layers of woolen blankets. She knew the land, and her presence brought a semblance of comfort to Emma. The forest clearing was eerie, bathed in a pale, silvery light. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining above, creating a claustrophobic canopy. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, flickering and twisting as if aware of what was to come. Jacob set up the ritual circle, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged the candles and scattered the sacred herbs. Emma felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, whose eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the circle. "It's time," Jacob said, his voice barely more than a whisper. They began the ritual, chanting the ancient words that echoed through the clearing. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted further. Shadows converged around them, a swirling vortex of malevolent energy. Spectral apparitions materialized, their faces contorted in agony and rage. Emma fought to maintain her focus, the psychological torment testing her resolve. The apparitions whispered her deepest fears, dredging up memories of her husband's death, her isolation, and her guilt. She felt herself faltering, her strength waning under the relentless assault. "Stay strong, Emma," Jacob urged, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're almost there." The shadows coalesced into a single, towering figure, Eliza Blackwood. Her eyes burned with an otherworldly light, her presence a palpable force of anger and sorrow. Emma faced her, feeling a surge of both fear and determination. "Eliza," Emma called out, her voice steady despite the tremors in her hands. "We know the truth. We know what happened to you. We're here to end this." Eliza's form wavered, her expression shifting from fury to something softer, more mournful. "You cannot change the past," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "But you can release me." Emma took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of her inner strength. "I release you, Eliza, from this curse, from this pain. We seek forgiveness and peace for you." The ritual reached its climax, the words of release resonating through the clearing. The air crackled with energy, and a blinding light enveloped them. Emma felt a searing heat, followed by an overwhelming sense of calm. The shadows screamed one last time before dissipating into the night. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. Eliza's spirit was gone, leaving behind a profound stillness. Emma collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Jacob knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them exhausted but relieved. Mrs. Thompson approached, her eyes wet with tears. "You did it," she said softly. "You freed her." Emma looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above, and felt a weight lift from her soul. The curse was broken, and with it, a new chapter in her life began. She had confronted her fears, her past, and emerged stronger. The shadows no longer held power over her, and Ravenswood could finally begin to heal. Chapter 7: Aftermath. The morning after the ritual, Emma awoke to a serene, sunlit house. The shadows that had plagued her dreams were gone, replaced by a gentle, healing light that streamed through the windows. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over her for weeks finally lifting. She sat up slowly, her body sore, but her spirit relieved. Jacob was already up, busy tending to the small, remaining wounds they had sustained during the ritual. He glanced up as Emma approached, his face etched with exhaustion, but softened by a genuine smile. "Good morning," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Emma took the cup, savoring the warmth. "Better, I think. It's hard to believe it's over." Jacob nodded, his eyes reflecting the same sentiment. "We did it. The town's free now." They moved through the house, cleaning up the remnants of their battle with the supernatural. As Emma straightened up the living room, she noticed a sense of calm she hadn't felt in months. The house, once a place of terror, now felt like a sanctuary. Later that day, Emma and Jacob visited Mrs. Thompson. The elderly woman looked more at peace than she had before, her face lined with both sorrow and relief. She had been working to make amends, reaching out to the townsfolk and sharing her family's history. "I've told them everything," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice shaky but resolute. "The truth about the curse and our part in it. They're starting to understand now." Emma nodded. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Thompson. It must have been hard, but it helped us in the end." The town itself was beginning to heal. The oppressive atmosphere that had cloaked Ravenswood was lifting, replaced by a tentative but hopeful sense of renewal. The residents, who had been skeptical and wary, were now starting to piece together their fractured history and face their past. Emma and Jacob walked through the town, observing the changes. People were smiling again, children playing in the streets without fear. The sense of dread that had once permeated the air was dissipating. As they stood by the old church, now bathed in sunlight and seemingly at peace, Emma reflected on her journey. She had faced her deepest fears, uncovered dark secrets, and emerged stronger. The bonds she had formed with Jacob and Mrs. Thompson had become a source of strength. "I couldn't have done this without you," Emma said, turning to Jacob. "You've been a true friend." Jacob smiled, his eyes reflecting the light of a new beginning. "And you've shown incredible strength." "We both have." Emma took a deep breath, feeling a sense of accomplishment and closure. Ravenswood was on its way to recovery, and so was she. The shadows were gone, and with them, the fear and pain that had once seemed insurmountable. As she looked out over the town, Emma knew that the future, while uncertain, was full of promise. Chapter 8. Lingering Echoes. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Ravenswood. Emma stood on the porch of her house, looking out over the town that had finally begun to recover from the darkness that had plagued it. The streets were alive with the laughter of children and the murmur of friendly conversations, a stark contrast to the fear and silence that had gripped the community. Yet, as Emma walked through the town, she couldn't shake a sense of unease. Despite the clear sky and the cheerful atmosphere, there were subtle signs that not everything had been entirely resolved. Occasionally, she would catch a flicker of shadow moving just out of the corner of her eye, or feel an inexplicable chill as she walked past certain buildings. One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner, she felt a cold draft sweep through the kitchen. She turned, expecting to find an open window, but the room was sealed tight. The sensation was fleeting but unsettling, leaving her with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Jacob, who had become a close friend and ally, was visiting her that night. They sat together, discussing the town's progress and their plans for the future. "Do you think it's really over?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it feels like the shadows are still there, just out of sight." Jacob looked thoughtful, his brow furrowed. "It's hard to say. Magic and curses aren't always so easy to eradicate completely. But we've made a huge step forward. The town is healing, and so are we." Emma nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering concern. She knew that while they had succeeded in breaking the major aspects of the curse, the residual effects might not vanish overnight. Determined to protect her newfound home, Emma decided to stay in Ravenswood. She had found a new sense of purpose in helping the town rebuild and safeguard it against any future threats. The community had embraced her, and she felt a deep connection to the place and its people. As the days passed, Emma found solace in her role as a guardian of the town's safety. She worked with local leaders and historians to ensure that the dark history was remembered and learned from, preventing future generations from falling prey to similar curses. On a crisp autumn evening, Emma stood at the edge of the forest, the trees whispering in the wind. She gazed out over the town, her heart a mix of hope and lingering unease. The shadows of the past were still present, but they no longer controlled her. Emma was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength and resolve to face it. The future was uncertain, but as she looked out over the peaceful town, Emma felt a sense of determination. She would protect Ravenswood and its people, no matter what. And with that thought, she turned back toward the warmth of her home, ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities ahead.